Hi, welcome. Thanks for tuning in to short video where we're going to discuss terminology and some background on economic experiments. My name's Matt Rousu. I'm Dean of the Sigmund Weiss School of Business at Susquehanna University.
Hi, welcome from me as well. I'm Carola Grebitus. I'm Associate Professor in the W.P. Carey School of Business at Arizona State University. Let me start by introducing you to some terminology that relates to economic experiments. So what do we mean when we talk about an experiment? We talk about a set of observations that we collect in a controlled environment. And you can think, for example, of a lab at a university where we do a study to figure out, are people actually willing to pay more for organic apples compared to conventional apples? And in the same sense, we talk about a trial where we have an indivisible unit of observation in this experiment. So in this case, when I want to know about your willingness to pay for an organic apple, I could use an experimental auction, and you would bid on conventional and organic apples. And then I can compare. Are you actually willing to pay more? So the bid would be the trial here. And then we have periods or rounds. They are self-contained units of time for observation. So just imagine you don't know much about organic. I conduct the auction, you bid on the organic apples, and then I introduce some information where I tell you about what is USDA organic. And we repeat the whole process. So now we have two rounds in one experiment. And this way I can also test whether the information increases or decreases your willingness to pay. Now, when you think of all the participants in this one group of trials, then we call that a session. So a session is usually with the same subjects, and I can have multiple sessions on a day. I can have multiple sessions in a week, and all sessions together will be all my observations, all my data that I can use to model the willingness to pay or preferences. Now, I can also have information between groups of subjects, between sessions. So maybe the first session does not receive any information about organic, but then the next session, I will start immediately giving some information about USDA organic. Now we are talking about treatment effects between subjects, and that would be a block. Overall, how I design my experiment will be the full experimental design, where I can say how many subjects do I need, how many sessions do I need, will I use an auction, a choice experiment, will there be information or not?
Okay, going on a little bit more. So thinking through the environment, so what are the agents' characteristics? So the participants have certain preferences, what resources are available. So what is the utility function of our participants? How many agents do we have? The institutions can matter. So what are the rules? So the order in this, or the sequence of when things occur in an experiment, going to be important. And then what we're really looking at here is, what is the behavior? So what do the participants in our experiments do? We're varying treatments. You might be, as Carola said, might be giving somebody different information on organic food. How does that change bidding behavior and demand for these products? So the experiments that we talk about, I mean, it's kind of funny, like, what is an experiment? Where does the line between experiment end and it goes to something else? There could be debates on this, but in general, right, it is a controlled environment. The experimenter, is able to control what is going on. Speaking of induced value theory experiments, Vernon Smith in the American Economic Review had kind of a seminal paper on induced value theory. Move forward. So For induced value theory, it's kind of interesting, and we've got a little bit more even on the next slide where we're kind of thinking about difference. What is an induced value experiment versus not? But it's an experiment where you are kind of essentially assigning the preferences to the participants in there. A number of experiments, this won't make sense, but there are some experiments where participants can come in and you as the experimenter are able to assign them values for items. So in auctions, it's often you're giving participants a particular fictitious product that has a particular value to them. So you are inducing the value that they have for the product. That wouldn't make sense in other types of experiments, right? If you are having people bid on subscription to Sirius XM radio, right? Like something I've never even considered having an experiment for, but right, everybody might have their own value on that. You're not going to, it'll be tough for you to induce the value there. But conditions for induced value, monotonicity and non-satiation, right? More is better than less, needs to be relevant, and a change in subject's utilities needs to be the consequence of the reward. The final note on here, privacy is really valuable in these, unless it's something you really want to examine as an experimenter. The experimenter has to have control, so the other items here aren't, the other rewards the agents could earn aren't going to be as relevant. I teach an undergraduate game theory class. We talk a lot about mechanism design, and when you're designing an experiment, right, your goal is to craft the experiment to get the answers you want, just in like the simplest setting, and trying to take away any outside factors that could influence participants' values or bidding behavior or whatever type of behavior you're trying to examine. You want to minimize any noise possible in these circumstances. Go to the next slide, thanks. So for auction experiments, which I'm more familiar with, of course, we often talk about homegrown versus induced values. So if somebody comes into an experiment with a value for a particular product, we think of that as a homegrown value. So what does a smoker, what's their value for for vaping products, right? That's homegrown, right? And it could definitely differ across participants. And maybe there's some things you could do to see if it changes by giving information. Does that change consumers' preferences? But participants have values for products coming into the experiment. If you are assessing demand for products, I want to say all, and all is always a dangerous word to use, but I think basically, and Carola, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but pretty much all of them are homegrown experiments. Induced values, participants are given the value when they arrive at the experiment. And as I mentioned earlier, often it's assigned value for a fictitious item. Usually this would be used to assess a theory. So I have a paper with Jason Lusk that was a book chapter, Market Price Endogeneity and the Accuracy of Value Elicitation Mechanisms. We did an induced value experiment to assess how the BDM mechanism performed, where the price for products in the BDM mechanism is chosen exogenously. It's not, it's just chosen by a random draw out of a bingo cage. How does that work versus, say, the second price in the random nth price auction? To do that, participants were actually given values for items, right? Like we said, okay, this item is worth this amount to you if you get it. That's an induced value experiment. Those can be used to test theories. What we found there, well, the BDM mechanism is definitely useful, and there are times you almost have to use it. It's the best alternative, and there aren't others that really work. When you have a choice, having endogenously chosen prices seems to lead to better bidder behavior. At least that's what we found in our paper. That's listed here. Okay, could move to the next slide. So money as a reward medium, right? If you're using induced values, usually you are saying something is worth a particular amount of money. The nice part about that, right, satisfies monotonicity, more is better. There is a really good question about how big the rewards should be. This would be both for induced values, if you're doing that, but also more generally, many of you may never do an induced value experiment, but you have to pay people participation fees. So 50% above a typical hourly rate might be a good amount for the students to induce them to show up for an hour or so. Money or laboratory currency. I've never used laboratory currency. Carola, have you used? Okay, no. I know others and who have labs might be saying, okay, here's your currency and it converts to cash at the end. But I've never used that. So if you can earn things, there are experiments where participants can earn money throughout. In many ways, the show up fee is separate from that, right? Participants need some amount of money to be induced to show up. Can that influence how much they bid? Well, yeah, it can. There's a couple ways you could handle this. One, you could randomize how much people get, and then you could try to control how do different amounts influence people's bidding behavior. That's really complicated, quite frankly. And I've in the papers that I've written, for the most part, I want to say exclusively, but I'm not 100% sure. We've given an amount and we figured, okay, if this affects demand, often we're looking at difference in bid prices across products. If it's increasing demand for one, in theory, it really should increase demand for another. Usually we're not doing products that are so wildly different that you have one inferior good and one normal good where the show up fee is going to really make a big difference. The show up fee for grants, I've noticed National Institutes of Health, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, some of these organizations in public health, they actually really care that there's enough funding where participants can participate really, and be fine. So if you're having them bid on cigarettes, they would, is it enough where they could bid to buy a pack of cigarettes? There are some things you might not be able to do that. I don't know that that's really as big of a concern personally, but if a granting agency thinks it's a big concern, naturally, you will want to make it a big concern of yours. And I think that relates to the bankruptcy problem. And Carola, you wrote this one down, but I'm assuming that means the idea that you'd need enough money so somebody doesn't literally spend more than they have. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that too, and that ties into the show up fee that I feel in our field. If I auction off apples, and the pound is probably, I don't know, I actually know that better from Germany, $2.99 or something like that, and the show up fee is $20. I think we usually do not run into these problems. But also what you said about the laboratory currency, I feel at least in the experiments that I do, I try to recruit the general public, and therefore I feel if I start using a laboratory currency, that just makes it harder for them to wrap their mind around. So
yeah, everybody knows what cash is.
Yeah.
The most expensive, most expensive product I think I've auctioned was a e-cigarette kit, which did market for about $40. But I think this was an experiment we literally offered 80 for. We were trying to get smokers, and there aren't that many smokers. So if somebody's possibly interested, we really wanted to offer a lot. Although the show up fee, just as a general, as an idea on this, it worked, although in some ways it worked a little too well, but that's a future video. I'll share some issues with that. But I think we can go to the next slide. Is this me or no? We're back to you, Carola.
Okay, so what is design parallelism? That is what we refer to when we evaluate how close our experiment is to reality. And sometimes the results of experiments can carry over to a non-experimental setting. So how close can we really mimic in the lab what is happening in the real world? That how close you want to have that actually depends on what you're doing. If you're testing a theory, you will likely not be very close to reality, because your goal is that your whole lab environment satisfies all the conditions of the theory that you are testing. And that will likely not be very close to a natural market. However, if you are conducting research that is applied, where you have a funding agency who actually wants to inform stakeholders like farmers or retailers, for example, you want to try to have an environment in your lab that is as close as possible to reality. If you're doing something on grocery store choices, you want to try to have product prototypes. If you can have shelving that looks like in a grocery store, that will make it much more realistic for the participants than if you just have a couple boxes on a piece of paper. However, whatever you do when it comes to the full design, try to be as simple as possible. The more complex your design, the more difficult will be the instructions, and that will make it harder for participants, especially if you're sampling from the general population. So when the instructions are difficult, they may not understand everything you are explaining to them, and that will ultimately bias your results. And a byproduct is that it also results in very difficult analysis, which may not give a clear picture of what's going on. The instructions actually lead to how much information you want to give to subjects. That depends on how much they need to know. Matt and I have another video on deception. You need to inform your participants, but if you are too detailed, that might actually bias the results. So it's a fine line where you have to decide how much do they need to know to make choices, to bid true to their willingness to pay or to their preferences. And then the next thing is, I touched a little bit on bias, is unbiasedness. The first thing you want to tell your participants when they come to your lab is that no behavior is right or wrong. They, especially the general public, they may think that you're looking for certain behavior, but that's not our goal, right? We just want to know how they are reacting to the situation we put them in the lab. Unless, of course, you want to test how somebody is behaving here. But in general, no behavior is right or wrong. We just want to see what are their preferences, what is their willingness to pay. And that also ties into the terminology. When we talk about incentives, we need to be neutral. So they don't think that, oh, if I behave in a certain way, I may get more. Unless, of course, you are negotiating, right? If you're negotiating and you're winning, then you may get more. But it's not that your behavior per se was right or wrong. References to the goods we use can also bias the results. So if you have organic and conventional, you have to be neutral, right? You cannot phrase it in a way that conventional is bad, right? It's bad for the environment. Unless, of course, again, you want to test the verbiage. But in general, you want to know what are they paying for conventional, what are they paying for organic, and not invoke specific behavior here. The last thing that can bias behaviors is, again, the instructions. How much economic context do you want to explain? If you have a student sample and they happen to be in your microeconomics class, then of course you can give them economic context. If it's lay people who have no economics background, they might be more confused by you using big words, right, rather than having very simple instructions.
Yeah. Just following up, I've had participants in experiments ask what they wanted, you know, like when it's bidding or whatever, and saying, how do you want me to respond? I'm like, well, we want you to, you know, often for bidding, we reiterate this, but it's like, I want you to think about what's the most you'd be comfortable paying for the product, and that's what you should be bidding, right? You can't do better than that. But for us, there's no right or wrong answer as long as that's what you're doing. There's no right or wrong number on the bid, as our goal is to find out your preferences, not for you to give us the right answer. But I think it's a very real thing where some participants coming in, especially, you know, for somebody coming in and getting $40 or $50 or $60, that they feel really grateful. And they're like, this is fantastic. I'm so happy I'm doing this. How can I help you? And that is an issue. The other, you know, using non-jargony words when going through is also, that's incredibly important. I've done a lot with smokers over the years, and certainly there are some, I've had PhDs come through who are smokers, but then maybe, I don't know, you want to stereotype, I'm pretty certain smokers on average, lower education levels. And And we have had some people who really struggled to, like, jargony words aren't going to help. But if you make it simple, everybody can understand. Think, what's the most you would pay? That's what you should bid. If you do that, you'll be doing well in this auction. The worst case is you're going to pay that highest amount, but you might get a very good deal on the auction depending on what happens with everybody else's bid or with the random draw. I mean, trying to put it in the way that a fourth grader could understand. Kind of, if any of you have written for newspapers, right, they say, like, write at a 6th grade level. You're not writing at a college level. So it's almost the same in explaining in experiments.
Yeah, it's exactly that, right? It's especially in applied economics, you want to infer general behavior, right? And that is not a research paper. Like when you said that, Matt, I was reminded when I took my first market research class in college, the instructor said, I always give my survey instrument to my grandma, and if she's fine, I know everybody will be fine. And I used to do that.
Yeah.
My grandma is over 90 now, so she can still understand. It's just she doesn't have email. So, but it has to be simple. And if you look at papers in AER, you will see that the core idea is usually very simple. What follows is usually not, but you want a clear-cut, simple idea, and so should be your instructions, and then you test that, and that is where you can have the most insight.
Correct. Yep, completely agree.
So the last part we have here is that when you plan your experimental design, make sure you consider your statistical analysis already, that you actually measure everything you need, that you have the right scales and whatever you want to do later, and that you also have a plan probably written down. Pre-analysis plans are becoming more common. So when you want to predict alternative theories, you need to clearly separate that. You need to be able to write down your models before you start, so that you may not be accused of, what's the word again? Phishing?
Oh, yeah, I don't know. I remember hearing like P hacking. Isn't that what it is? Where you try to run like every analysis possible? Because in theory, if you had a data set that had no actual correlations, but you run 100 tests at a 5% significance level, you should, on average, you're going to find 5 statistically significant results out of that from the pure noise, because you had a 5% level. You're willing to take that error. So.
Yeah, and the last 2 points here, one that can probably not be pointed out too many times, you can never have the same participant in more than one session. Never. Just never. It needs to be for statistical independence of the observations. You need new participants. The simplest reason would be that they already have gone through the process, so their behavior will be different the second time from the first time. And another one is ordering effects. So when you have a study where you introduce information, your design is in a way that you cannot have the second round before the first, because once you have introduced the information, they have the information. However, if there's no case like that, randomize the order of your treatments, because there could be an ordering effect simply in how things are structured. So that will allow you to respond to reviewers who say, like, what? How can I know that this result is not just because of this, because something else was always first? So if you have it randomized, then you can say, no, sometimes this was first, sometimes the other one was first, so it was completely random.
Yep.
And that concludes our presentation today.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Hope you have a great day.